We're going to consider just 24 days. Our focus of tonight resides in just three men who combined their energy and enthusiasm to fulfill just one purpose. And hopefully by the end of tonight you'll have a detailed understanding of the first chapter of Haggai, and also an appreciation for God's desire to dwell with us. Now, as there is genuinely so much to look at tonight, I'll be making some comments like take a note of, or look at in your own time, or write in your margin some of these quotes. So it'd be good to have a pen and paper handy for those parts. They're typically quotes, or notes on your phone, for instance, something that you'll be able to look at later on. But before we get deeper into tonight, I think it might be worth spending a few minutes recapping on the timeline of our first study. So I've put that together. Now, it might take a few moments to work out what's going on the screen. Also, possibly, many of you won't be able to read the writing, or my handwriting anyway, if it's not already too small. So I'll read it out as we go. First thing to make sure to understand is, of course, the dates are before Christ, BC, meaning the earliest point in history is still on the left despite it being 610. So we head towards the right, 430 BC. I trust we're all aware of that anyway. But we began our story even before this timeline, last class, in 700 BC with Hezekiah, where Hezekiah showed the king of Babylon all his wealth. He left nothing out. And Isaiah, through a prophecy of God, foretold the fall of Jerusalem, and for Hezekiah's descendants to be taken captive as eunuchs. And in about 609 BC, our first date on the screen, King Josiah dies after going to fight Pharaoh Necho. So Necho in that gains control of Jerusalem and puts in the throne Jehoahaz, who after 3 months is replaced by Jehoiakim. By 605 BC, we have the Battle of Carchemish, where Babylon defeats both Assyria and Egypt, who were forming this alliance, driving Egypt back to her borders and also gaining control over Jerusalem. And this is what we call Nebuchadnezzar's first siege and the beginning of the 70 years captivity, shown by the dark red line. It's also the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy against Jerusalem, that Jerusalem would fall and eunuchs would be taken. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar seizes Jerusalem again for the second time, and Jehoiakim dies. Jehoiachin reigns for a very short time, and then Zedekiah is placed on the throne. And each time this happens, there seems to be some sort of rebellion from the kings of Judah, provoking Nebuchadnezzar to come back. So lo and behold, he comes back again, 586 BC. After 2 years of sieging Jerusalem, he takes control and destroys it. Literally destroys everything. The temple, the walls, the houses. He also takes all of Judah captive, along with all the vessels in the temple. So that is the beginning of our second 70-year period, to do with the desolation of the temple, because the temple was destroyed. And that's shown by the blue line on the timeline. And so we wait until 539 BC, when Babylon falls into the hands of Medo-Persia. And a few years later, King Cyrus of Persia makes a decree for the 50,000 Jews in captivity to make a 1,500-kilometre, 4-month, grueling journey across the desert to Jerusalem to build the temple, also fulfilling some other prophecies in Scripture. Officially then, this 70 years captivity is finished. The Jews are finally returning to the land. And although after this progress is made, an altar is built, the temple foundation is laid, there ends up being significant opposition to the building, and it stops for 15 years. Until in 520 BC, Haggai and Zechariah come along and encourage the people to start building the temple again. That's where we are going to be looking tonight. That's the action that we get to see. So 4 years later, if we continue, the temple's completed, therefore finishing another 70 years this time for the desolation of the temple. The story does continue briefly. I'll keep it brief. In 457 BC, Ezra returns with 5,000 exiles to rebuild the spiritual law and integrity of the nation. And in 444 BC, Nehemiah returns with 42,000 captives to build the walls, and in fact is governor for 12 years. Bringing us finally, I didn't mention this last time, to 432 BC, the very end of our Old Testament period and the prophet Malachi. And at this point, if you're still lost, I'm sorry. Might be worth revisiting last class from 2 weeks ago. And Haggai fits, as this says, in 520 BC. And in fact, Haggai is all over in 1 year. Everything in these 2 chapters, one of which we read tonight, happens in the 1 year. In fact, really, it happens in 4 months. And the format of the presentation tonight will include on the screen some key themes that I found important in my study of Haggai. You may wish to mark these in as you go. I'll show each section and where they can be marked, but if not, easy to take note of and do at a later date. The key points will be placed either side of the Bible passage in the middle in big readable font. So if you can't read the Bible part, you can look at the Bible in front of you, which makes sense anyway, and read the nice font that I've got to summarise our point. So these are the key themes. Now the colour code I'm going to use on the slides, if you want to try and work ahead, go for it, but there'll be plenty of time to do it through tonight, or if you make note in your own time. Let's consider though these key themes one by one, starting with in the 2nd year of Darius the king. This is 520 BC, we've said that already. And in fact, Haggai is so specific, we even know the day and the date in which month each prophecy and action occurs. So consider in verse 1, we have the first day of the 6th month. In 1 verse 15, jumping forward, we have the 24th day of the same month, the 6th month. So that's 23 days later, taking in 24 days in total. In 2 verse 1, we have the 21st day of the 7th month, a month later. And in 2 verse 10, 2 verse 18, and 2 verse 20, we have the same day, the 24th day of the 9th month. So I'll repeat that again. We got the first day of the 6th month, 24th day of the 6th month, 21st day of the 7th month, and 24th day of the 9th month, spanning less than 4 months. A lot less than 4 years, but less than 4 months. And time is a key theme of this book. Judah, or the remnant of Israel, seem to be considering the time really closely. And we'll see that when we get to look at 1 verse 2. So just hold on to that thought. Another key theme is, of course, house. This book is about building the house of Yahweh, or the temple of Yahweh. Haggai also compares it to Israel's own houses that they were building instead of building the temple, and they've been highlighted purple for a total of 13 times throughout the book. Consider your ways is another key theme, one that I was actually considering making the theme of these classes. It occurs predominantly in verse 5 of our chapter and verse 7, but it also, or at least the word consider, also appears in verse 15 and verse 18 of chapter 2. Haggai speaks of the frustration of a life in which God is neglected. There is no purpose, no end product, no hope in their vision. He calls on his readers, or indeed listeners, to consider where their life is headed, to consider that end product that all their many hours of work was leading towards. Hold that thought for 1 verse 6 when we get to it. Be strong. Be strong is used only in chapter 2 verse 4, 3 times, to encourage Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the people to keep going, to believe in the house of God and the glory of God. All the labour of your hands, verse 11, 2 verse 14 and 2 verse 17, is regarding God's total response and consideration of Israel, that everything was included, be it within the punishment or within his blessings. The work of our hands reflects where our heart is, that everyone will receive according to their labour. Bit of a Bible echo there. But also that labour is never in vain if it is done for the Lord. And Israel was shown this through the message of Haggai. Moving on, the word of Yahweh 5 times, Seth Yahweh of hosts, or indeed just Yahweh of hosts 14 times, Seth Yahweh 7 times, and if we take just Yahweh by itself, 9 times, and we've purposely separated those 4 ideals. And it really indicates the focus of this book, especially Yahweh of hosts. It's about God, that God is in control of everything, that God is who we are serving and who we give glory to, and also that Haggai is God's prophet, speaking directly to the people God's words. The people in Haggai's time had been focusing on themselves, not on God, and that's what needed to change. And if you want to quote for your margins, consider 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 13, something to read in your own time in regards to the words of God. That was 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 13. Now if we consider briefly, or specifically, the Yahweh of hosts, or Yahweh of armies, we know that this shows the help that Yahweh is offering the people, reminding them of the power of God, that they needed no horses, chariots, or kings, for he is not only omnipotent, all-powerful, but has a mighty army amongst the people to save them from opposition if they serve him, to help those who were willing to seek his help. And finally, Haggai, Zechariah, and Zerubbabel. I said that wrong. Haggai, Zerubbabel, and Joshua, our 3 men of tonight, uniting with one purpose. So let's get into that properly. Haggai 1 verse 1 to 11. It is the first of only 2 main sections within Haggai 1. This is the first prophecy of Haggai. It's a message to arouse, to get up, to build the temple of God. And hopefully you'll see that theme come out as we consider these 11 verses. And I was going to read them, but we are going to move on to 1 verse 1, right at the beginning. A short little introduction from Haggai. Something that many books of the Bible have, especially prophetic books, usually goes like, at this time, the word of Yahweh comes to this prophet saying these things. But we do have more in that, of course. In fact, our 3 men are introduced in here straight up, so we can learn something from them already. And as we are in 520 BC, we know the 70 years of captivity has well and truly ended. That was 15 years ago. And we're still 77 years before Nehemiah comes onto the scene. But there's been no activity for 15 years in building the temple. We've got an altar, we've got a foundation, but that's it. So King Darius Festive, I still don't know how to say that, but King Darius, he reigns from 521 BC, just a year before, to 486, a decent 35-year reign. He managed to establish an empire-wide currency. He led many construction projects, including the rebuilding of some Egyptian temples that a king before him, King Cambyses, had previously destroyed sometime during his reign of 530 to 522 BC. Now that's a bit of an interesting comparison just to think about, the fact that King Darius completed buildings of temples in Egypt as well as Yahweh's house, Yahweh's temple being completed during his reign. Just some food for thought. Being the first day of the month, we have the festival of the new moon. That occurs in the Jewish calendar on the first day of each month. And if you want a quote, the festival of the new moon is described in Numbers 28, verse 11 to 15, and it describes the festival and what they offered. We're also introduced here to Haggai the Prophet. He is, as the Hebrew word for prophet teaches us, an inspired man, to speak by inspiration the words of God. Already we know that God's words are embedded throughout this book, since that was a key theme. In fact, almost every line is the words of God. So naturally, Haggai is the prophet. He would have been very well respected by his people around him, the remnant of Judah, shown clearly by the way they responded to his message. We don't really know much more about Haggai. All we know is his name is Haggai, and he's a prophet of God. He is still, though, a very unique prophet in terms of other prophets within our Bible. No other prophet would see such an immediate change in the hearts of the people they were speaking to. Because all throughout Israel's history, these messengers of God were ignored and despised. Their words were often rejected as lies, and people refused generally to heed their warnings and advice. But not so with Haggai. The people respond clearly to Haggai's message, almost immediately. And as with many names in Scripture, we can also learn from the meaning of the Hebrew name. Haggai means festive, or festive one. It is from another root word to mean festival, the very same root word that is translated feast, used in reference to all the feasts, but especially the Feast of Tabernacles. There is also another reference on the screen to the Feast of Tabernacles. We considered last time this feast as it was observed in Ezra 3. This is when the Jews had first returned to Jerusalem from Babylon. We determined last time that this feast highlights dependence on God, that the flimsy booths they made were insufficient to truly protect them, but rather they needed to place their complete dependence on God, relating also to the Exodus and coming back to the land of promise from Egypt. So now we see Haggai's name itself, meaning festive one, being the epitome of his message to the returned captives, to inspire and encourage them, to rejoin in God's goodness and mercy towards them, and for them to respond by giving of their wealth and time to serve God. Haggai's message, Haggai's purpose, is a call to action, to rejoice and to shout for joy. Consider Psalm 5, verse 11. It says, "Let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee." And the word defendest from Psalm 5, verse 11 means to entwine as a screen, to cover over, to protect, reminding us of those very booths that the Israelites were building in the Feast of Tabernacles. So let us rejoice in God. Okay, so we come to Zerubbabel, descendant of Babylon, as in that's what his name means. Zerubbabel, or Babel, descendant of Babylon. He's known as the governor of Judah, that is the social leader or captain, as the margin says, of the nation. And he works alongside Joshua, who we'll consider in a moment. Zerubbabel is the son of Shealtiel, or Salathiel, both of whom occur in the lineage of Christ through Mary in Luke 3, verse 27. Zerubbabel and Salathiel. Zerubbabel was then a descendant of the kings of Judah, leading all the way to Christ. So he's in the line of Christ. Now, Shealtiel means "I have asked of God," for those taking notes on the Hebrew meanings. Joshua Yahweh saved. Josedek, Yahweh righted. And as 1 Corinthians 6 verse 15 will show from the margin, Joshua is indeed a descendant of the high priest Aaron. So therefore, Joshua is rightly the spiritual leader of the nation, the high priest of this nation. So what did these two men do? Together, by the way, because they seem to be placed side by side more often than they're not. In Haggai and Ezra and even Nehemiah. So in every one of the 5 references to Joshua and Zerubbabel, in Haggai, Joshua is identified as the high priest. So every one of the 5 references to Joshua, Josh is the high priest. And in 3 of them, Zerubbabel is described as the governor of Judah. And these 2 complementary roles identify the spiritual, Joshua, and social, Zerubbabel, leaders of the nation. In both men, the people were to see an example of what spiritual leadership and character is. And as with leaders, all through the nation's history, these 2 men were the ones the nation looked to for guidance. When they were corrupt or weak in their faith, so was the nation. The nation struggled and floundered spiritually. But this is in contrast with men such as Hezekiah and Joshua, who incited the nation to achieve great things. And this is the reason we need Haggai. Because without Haggai, Zerubbabel and Joshua do not have the enthusiasm they need to incite this nation. But it's also why Joshua and Zerubbabel are mentioned together, because they're working together to make this happen. All through Ezra's account of the captives' early actions, Zerubbabel and Joshua are presented as providing the enthusiasm and guidance for the people's actions. They're the ones who build the altar. They are the ones who lead the work on the temple's rebuilding. They're the ones who reject the help of the Samaritans around them. And they are the ones who lead the efforts to continue the temple work after Haggai and Zechariah's message. So the picture is presented of 2 faithful, wise, mature men, assisted by 2 enthusiastic prophets, that is Haggai and Zechariah. Together, these 4 individuals, particularly the 3 men we're considering tonight, reshaped the nation, inspiring them to rebuild and continue in a life of faith. And all of that was just one verse. Not to worry. Let's continue with the story. Consider your ways. Now, that first verse, thus speaketh Yahweh of hosts, we've referred to Yahweh of hosts already. In fact, there is so much information that we can take from Yahweh of hosts in Scripture. Not only is it used 14 times in Haggai, but many more times in Zechariah. So if you do wish to see some more of Yahweh's of hosts, let me know. I have a few notes that may interest you. Verse 2 to 6, consider your ways. In here, God challenges the laziness of Israel, really their lack of enthusiasm. This people say the time is not come, the time that Yahweh's house should be built. So essentially, they're justifying their reason for not building the temple. It's not time. We can't do it yet. And this is like the complete opposite to David back in 2 Samuel 7. David was looking at everything he'd built in the kingdom and going, something's not right because we have a tabernacle here, still with curtains, we're in these really fancy houses. Something isn't right. We need to build God a proper temple. But the Jews, despite the fact they could be looking at their houses going, that's it, that's done, they're looking at their calendars going, no, not yet. Now, why might they be thinking this? Well, firstly, being so particular about prophecy and dates, the Jews would well have known that it wasn't 70 years yet since the destruction of the temple. So, naturally, you can't go to fulfill that prophecy yet by building the temple. which is, if you like, taking God's prophecy and God's will into your own hands and your own time. Now, we know there were actually 2 periods of 70 years, and the captivity one, that was already fulfilled. There had also been a substantial amount of opposition from the surrounding nations. I mean, that really is why they stopped working 15 years ago. And in their mind, oppression meant God wasn't blessing their work on the temple, so we can't do it yet. What they didn't realise, though, is actually the other way round. The oppression was a result of the lack of work, not a reason for the lack of work. And we learn that later in verse 9 to 11. So we'll keep moving. And as part of the oppression from God, there was also this really big drought in verse 11, and therefore a really poor harvest. And it's all leading to them saying, God is not blessing the work on our temple. There are a couple of other possible reasons. In Ezra 1 verse 2 and Ezra 4 verse 5, we have 2 contradictory orders from Persia. One says from Cyrus, go and build. The other one says, stop building. Bit conflicting if you were the people back then. We saw last time that this temple, or at least the foundation they built, wasn't to the standard, in their mind, of Solomon's grand temple. But in that, they were also getting absolutely no spiritual benefit from building their own houses while they let the temple of God lay in ruins. That's in verse 4. I do think we need to be careful, though. We can say all these things. Sometimes we can fall into this trap too. When we think that the oppression that we're coming under, the hard times, poor health, whatever it may be, that sometimes we ascribe the wrong reasons to it. So come to 2 Corinthians 4. Leave your hand in Haggai, because that's obviously where we're staying for most of the night, but 2 Corinthians 4. Second Corinthians 4 verse 17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. The things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So this is a quick encouragement to all of us. We have a future hope. We have the resurrection to trust in. We have God's mercy to rely on. The pressures of our life are preparing us for God's kingdom. They are teaching us how to be reliant on our God. And not only that, anything that happens in this life, we cannot even start to compare to the eternal weight of glory that we will receive. It's beyond all comparison. It really does put our life in perspective. This life is but for a moment. And back in Haggai, we read verse 4. Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Or as the ESV says, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your panelled houses, while this house lies in ruins? Really, the point is quite clear. You've made these fantastic panelled houses with all the wood that was meant for the house of God, and you're dwelling in them. You've actually finished building them, possibly quite some time ago. It's been 15 years. And yet, this house of God, my house, dwells in ruins. You're just watching on, enjoying the house that you are dwelling in. And you're letting God's house fall apart even more. That same word waste is used in verse 9, where it says, right near the bottom, because of mine house that is waste. It's referring to the same thing. It's using the same word. It's also used in Nehemiah 2 verse 3 and 2 verse 17. So Nehemiah 2 verse 3 and 17, where Nehemiah says, Jerusalem lieth waste. The word means parched, ruined, completely empty of water, parched, and completely in ruins. Now therefore, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, verse 5, consider your ways. Consider is actually 3 Hebrew words moulded into just one English word. It's amazing when they choose to do that. It literally means to put your heart upon. It's used also in Deuteronomy 11 verse 18. Another great quote for the margin. This says, Deuteronomy 11 verse 18, therefore shall ye lay up in your heart these words, and in your soul, and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. So that, those 3 words, lay up in your heart. So God here is directly drawing the remnant of Israel back to the principle of the law, that you need to purposefully make the words of God part of your life, part of your heart, your soul, your hands, your eyes. Take it with you wherever you go. And that's just consider. There is also your ways. Consider your ways. That is again just one Hebrew word. Well, not again, but it is just one Hebrew word, meaning your trodden road, or figuratively, especially here, your course of life. Set your heart upon your course of life. Earnestly search through what you're doing. It's used in Psalm 85 verse 12 to 13. Yea, Yahweh will give that which is good, and our land shall yield her increase. Righteousness shall go before him, and shall set us in the way of his steps. Allowing you to think of the way of your steps, how you are living your life. This reminds us of a few other really important quotes in Scripture, like Micah 6 verse 8. He hath shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with thy God. Or 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5, the ESV. Examine yourselves. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this is about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test? Or Hebrews 4 verse 12 to 13. Another thing about how God's words can change our lives. For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and opened unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Consider your ways. Finally, in verse 6, back in Haggai, ye have sown much, and you bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm, and he that earneth wages to put it in a bag with holes. A picture of this rapid economic decline, unemployment. There isn't enough to eat or drink, or even enough clothes to go around. The economy is so bad, we have what nowadays we'd call inflation, where the money you have literally goes nowhere. Everything that comes in is spent straight away, a bag with holes. At this point, we only need to turn to Deuteronomy 28 to realise what is going on. If you come there quickly, Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15. You may recall Deuteronomy 28 is about the blessings and cursings that were spoken to Israel in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28 verse 15. Bit of a warning. It shall come to pass if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And the rest of Deuteronomy 28, you'd be able to pick most of them out, are all these curses. Like verse 16, cursed in the city, cursed in the field, cursed be thy basket and thy store. The point is, curses on Israel's produce would be a work of God and would only happen when they are unrighteous. In a sense, their natural prosperity would be a reflection of their spiritual prosperity. And it's always the spiritual change or the spiritual decline that comes first. And in the case of Haggai at the moment, that is exactly the problem. They are unrighteous by not building God's house, and God is punishing them with their land, their economy, and their welfare, just as he had promised. So what next? Where is Haggai going with this? Well, he changes his tune ever so slightly, because now we have a call for action. This is what's wrong, and this is what we need to do. Consider God's house, and you will be blessed. Consider your ways, says God. Go up to the mountains. That is actually a plural word, mountains, because most other translations use the plural form, be it mountains or hills or hill country. The idea is go up and get the wood from the mountains. Why though? Didn't they have all that wood from the cedars of Lebanon? Well, back in Ezra 3 verse 7 they did, but now it's gone. They've taken it all to use in their own houses, so of course they need more wood. So the people need to go and collect local wood to build God's house. Might also be worth mentioning at this point that the temple itself isn't built with just wood. It's not the wood structures that you typically see today. In Ezra 5 verse 8, which is around this time, says, "Be it known unto the king that when we went into the province of Judea, to the house of the great God, which is builded with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls. And this work goeth fast on, and prosperity is in their hands. So the wood will be for panelling, just like in their houses, where the house itself is made of stone. So go up, get this wood, build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, says Yahweh." Come to Proverbs 3. I really like this quote. Proverbs 3 and verse 9 and 10. Proverbs chapter 3. Maybe from verse 6. Verse 5. "Then shalt thou understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of God. For Yahweh giveth wisdom, out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding." Verse 7. "He layeth up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. He keepeth the paths of judgment and preserveth the way of his saints. Then shalt thou understand righteousness and judgment and equity, yea, every good path, when wisdom entereth into thine heart, and knowledge is pleasant unto thy soul." That would make a lot more sense. I was reading that going, where's my main point? Let's go verse 9 and 10 to save reading even more. "Honour Yahweh with thy substance," that's better, "and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine." Much better. Essentially, you give to God, God will give to you. You honour God with your substance and the first fruits of your increase, and God will respond by making sure that your barns are full and your wine fully stocked and overflowing. So Haggai says, if you honour God by building the house of God, he will respond by taking pleasure in it and being glorified. Flick over to Isaiah 66. I'll read the right one this time. Isaiah 66, verse 1 and 2. Because there is, in fact, another lesson we can learn from this. Isaiah 66, verse 1 and 2. Thus saith Yahweh, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye build unto me? And where is the place of my rest? For all those things hath mine hand made, and all those things have been, saith Yahweh. But to this will I look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and trembleth at my words. So God is taking pleasure in them building the temple, but only when he is being glorified by something else. Even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and trembleth at my word. It isn't the temple God is looking at, it's the work of the people. Those who offer to God with the right spirit, God will be pleased with and be glorified by those people. But we find a little bit later in Haggai 2 that they didn't quite get that part right. Verse 9, ye looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when ye brought it home, I did blow upon it. To blow means to wither, to melt away. Now we don't have time, but if you write down Ezekiel 22, verse 17 to 22, it is actually also in your margin, God describes this process in reference to Israel in very dramatic word pictures. To wither and to melt away. Continuing in Haggai, why, saith Yahweh of hosts? Because of mine house that is waste. And ye run, every man unto his own house. And to run really implies great diligence. The amount of effort they've been putting in their own houses, even in just dwelling in them, is incredible. Yet God's house is still in ruins. It's parched. Therefore, the heaven over you is stayed from dew. So not even the dew in the morning. No rain, no dew. Now the earth is parched. And the earth is stayed from her fruit, so we have a famine. Naturally, a lack of fruit because of the lack of dew. And when both the rain and the dew is stopped, we have a very serious drought going on. It also happened in the time of Elijah. A note for your margin, 1 Kings 17 verse 1 says the rain and the dew was stopped. And I called. God called. God is in control. God called a drought upon the land, and upon the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labour of the hands. Do you get it? It's a drought on everything. If we think carefully, there are actually many quotes that refer to some of the key things that were targeted. Jeremiah 31 verse 12 being just one of them. You might actually look at that. Jeremiah 31 verse 12. Because the corn, the wine, and the oil are indicators of a nation's prosperity. The more you have, the more prosperous you are considered to be. So here Judah had none. What Jeremiah shows us, Jeremiah 31 verse 12, is that these same indicators are important to God because they're part of his promise with the kingdom. Jeremiah 31 verse 12. Therefore shall they come and sing in the height of Zion, shall flow together to the goodness of Yahweh, for wheat, and for wine, and for oil, and for the young of the flock and of the herd. And their soul shall be as a watered garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. A complete contrast to the days of Haggai. So God's in control. The nation's prosperity is at its lowest, and God cares about this. He wants it to be better. The life and prosperity of the nation is, of course, important to him, but only if they turn to him. Leviticus 26, along with Deuteronomy 28 that we've already looked at, go a lot into the details about blessings and cursings. Blessings included rain and crops. Cursing was drought and no yield from the harvest, hunger, and the warning was simple. If the people didn't respond, enemies will attack, oppression, they'll be rescattered. If obedient, God would dwell amongst them, just like a temple signified, God dwelling among them. Leviticus 26 also tells us, if you look after God's house, he will look after yours. So what next? What is the response of the people? We've seen what's wrong. We've seen Haggai's encouragement. What is the response? The voice is obeyed. Fantastic. Simply, the enthusiasm of Zerubbabel and Joshua from hearing Haggai in verse 1 to 11, that enthusiasm spreads to absolutely everyone through the message, through this message. They listened, they obeyed, or as obey means, to hear intelligently. Reminds you of that classic verse, it is better to obey than to sacrifice. It's better to hear God's message intelligently and to change your life than to sacrifice to God without the right attitude. Finally, the people of Haggai are obeying God. We're now moving towards blessings and away from the cursing of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. This is Yahweh, their God. We have progress just in that. Now let's just look at the fear before Yahweh, because it does say at the end, the people did fear before Yahweh. Firstly, it's a reverent or godly fear. Like consider Hebrews 12 verse 28. Wherefore, we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. In Proverbs 2, we've already read verse 6 to 9 of Proverbs 2, so we're going to read verse 3 to 9 of Proverbs 2, because now it makes sense and relevance. Proverbs 2, and I have Proverbs 2. Proverbs 2, verse 3 to 9. Yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her wisdom as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of God. For Yahweh giveth wisdom. Out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. He layeth up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. He keepeth the paths of judgment and preserveth the way of his saints. Then shalt thou understand righteousness and judgment and equity, yea, every good path. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. It brings an attitude of hatred towards evil, from verse 13 of Proverbs 2, and this strong motivation to avoid evil. It brings a strong confidence. The fear of Yahweh is a fountain. That can be found in Proverbs 14, verse 26 and 27. And yet, when we look at Haggai, or indeed in Zechariah 8, verse 16 and 17, we find that Haggai's people still have a long way to go when considering wisdom. These are the things, says Zechariah, that ye shall do. Speak ye every man the truth to his neighbour. Execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates. And let none of you imagine evil in your hearts against his neighbour. And love no false oath. For all these are the things that I hate, saith Yahweh. So although we're getting there with the fear of Yahweh, they still have some work to do. But we are getting there. back to Haggai 1 verse 13. Then spake Haggai, Yahweh's messenger, in Yahweh's message unto people. Haggai is now described as an angel, a messenger of Yahweh, a truly privileged position for Haggai to be in, a testament to his character and faith towards God and towards these people. He's saying, or Yahweh is saying, I am with you. A genuine response from God to their change of heart. It's our theme for these classes. These people have responded to the call to action. They are commended for this. Zechariah 1 verse 3 over the page. Therefore say thou unto them, Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, Turn ye unto me, saith Yahweh of hosts, and I will turn unto you, saith Yahweh of hosts. They did, and he did. I am with you. And Yahweh stirred up, or Yahweh opened up the eyes. He woke up the spirit of Zerubbabel, and the spirit of Joshua, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, because it's not the work that God cares about. It was the hearts of these men and women, their spirit, their disposition towards God and his house. We know that God's desire is to dwell with men, or to dwell with us. God knew that this physical house they were building wouldn't last. God knew that the people are the ones who are saved, that the ecclesia is actually the real temple of God. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 16 says, And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of God, in fact, the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Well, turn with me finally to Ephesians 2. One of my favourite Bible echoes when considering the book of Haggai, because the book of Haggai is about building the temple of God, and Ephesians 2 puts it very clearly in verse 19 to 22. Now therefore, Ephesians 2 verse 19, Ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. Brethren, sisters, and young people, we too must be careful with our activity that we do in the eyes of God. We must consider the house that we are building. We are all the temple of God, every single one of us. The Spirit of God dwells in us. The choices we make in life matter. Are we building the temple of God, or are we building our own houses? God has promised us a future kingdom where he will fill the earth with his glory, with people who love God and obey him, people who are the temple of God. So are we building with the right spirit? Are we looking to Christ and building around him? These three men work together with one purpose, to motivate the people into action. The words of Haggai motivated Zerubbabel and Joshua to spread enthusiasm to the whole people, to start building. It may have taken them 23 days from the first word to when the work begins, but those 23 days see a huge reformation of the people, to build, and to serve. And this is where we will pause. That might have made more sense if that was up on the screen. I'll leave that up in a second, but join with me in 2 weeks' time to consider 2 temples and 1 God as we delve into Haggai 2.